Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Zodiac Sleep Channel. Tonight's story belongs to Virgo, to the one who notices everything, the one who sees the crooked frame on the wall that no one else sees, the small mistake in the work everyone else called finished, the single thing out of place in a room of 100 things, and who cannot rest until it is set right. Because setting things right is how they love, even when no one has asked them to. To the one who holds themselves to a standard so high that they have never once, not for a single day, felt that they were enough. To the one who serves quietly, fixes quietly, improves quietly, and lies awake at night, replaying the one small thing they could have done better, while the 100 things they did perfectly disappear unremembered. To the one who has been told they are too critical, too particular, too hard to please, as if caring about doing things well were a flaw, as if the desire to make something truly good was something to apologize for. Tonight's story is about Felix. He is 26 years old, and he is a master watchmaker in the mountains of Switzerland, where he builds by hand some of the most precise and beautiful timepieces in the world. He has spent his whole life measuring time perfectly. Tonight, alone in his workshop, before the most important delivery of his career, he is finally going to learn the one thing his perfect instruments could never teach him, that he was allowed to rest inside the time he kept so flawlessly for everyone else. Get comfortable. Take a slow breath. Let the ticking slow down. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The workshop sat on the second floor of an old stone house at the edge of a village in the Swiss Jura, the region where watchmaking had been born 300 years ago, where the long winters had once given farming families nothing to do through the dark months but bend over tiny mechanisms by candlelight and learn, slowly, across generations, to make the most precise machines human hands had ever produced. Felix worked in that tradition, in that exact lineage, in a room that had been a watchmaker's workshop for over a century, and tonight, as on most nights, he was still there long after the village below had gone dark. The room was a study in order. This was the first thing anyone noticed when they entered, on the rare occasions anyone was allowed to enter, which was almost never, because Felix did not like people in his workspace, not because he was unfriendly, but because people, however careful, disturbed things, shifted the light, breathed dust, introduced into a perfectly arranged environment the small chaos of their presence. Every tool hung in its place on the wall, arranged not alphabetically or by size, but by the frequency with which he used them, an order he had refined over years until reaching for any instrument required no thought at all, his hand simply going to where the tool had to be. The tweezers and the loops, and the tiny screwdrivers, the brass and steel files, the oils in their numbered bottles, the cleaning solutions, the dust covers, all of it in its place, all of it exactly where it should be, a room in which nothing was ever lost because nothing was ever left where it did not belong. He was a Virgo. He had always known this about himself, in the way you know the shape of your own hands so completely that you forget it is a particular shape and not simply the way hands are, the need for order, the eye that found a flaw, the deep, almost physical discomfort of things left undone or done badly, a discomfort that other people seemed not to feel at all, that he had spent his whole life assuming everyone felt and had only gradually realized was his alone, his particular burden and his particular gift, the thing that made him able to do what almost no one else could do, and also the thing that meant he could almost never stop. On the bench before him, under the bright, focused light of his work lamp, lay the watch. It was nearly finished. It was the finest thing he had ever made, and tomorrow morning he was going to deliver it to the man who had commissioned it, and Felix had been sitting here for 3 hours tonight, unable to leave, because he was almost certain there was still something wrong with it, and he could not yet find what it was. Chapter 2. The watch had taken him 8 months. The man who had commissioned it was one of the wealthiest in Europe, a collector who already owned dozens of the finest watches ever made, and who had come to Felix not because Felix was famous, which he was not, but because a certain kind of person, having acquired everything that money could simply buy, eventually develops an appetite for the one thing money cannot, which is something made entirely by hand by a person who refuses to compromise. Word of Felix had reached this man the way water finds the lowest point, slowly and inevitably, through the quiet channels of people who knew about such things, and the man had climbed the narrow road to the village himself, and had sat in Felix's workshop, and had said, "Make me the best watch you are capable of making. Take as long as you need. Spare nothing." It was, Felix had understood immediately, both a dream and a trap. A dream because no watchmaker is ever given that freedom, the freedom from compromise, from deadlines, from the thousand small surrenders that ordinary commercial work demands. And a trap because Felix's particular affliction was that he never thought anything was the best he was capable of making. There was always a finer finish possible on the bridge of the movement, a more perfect alignment of the wheels, a smoother action in the mechanism, a deeper black in the polished steel of the hands. The phrase, "the best you are capable of," was, to a mind like his, not a target, but an abyss, because his capability was not a fixed thing. With an edge he could reach, it was a horizon that retreated exactly as fast as he advanced toward it. He picked up the loop and fitted it to his eye and bent over the watch again, and the world narrowed to the bright circle of magnification, the universe of the mechanism, where the tiny wheels and springs and jewels sat in their impossible precision, a machine smaller than a coin, containing over 300 individual parts, each one made or finished by his own hands, each one capable of being judged. He had assembled and disassembled this movement more than 30 times. He knew it the way a person knows the face of someone they love, every plane and angle of it, and as he looked at it now, in the silence of the workshop, he felt the familiar thing rise in him, the thing that had no off switch, the relentless searching attention that scanned and scanned and scanned for the flaw. And there, he thought, there it is, the decoration on one of the internal bridges, the hand-applied pattern of tiny parallel lines that no one would ever see because it sat inside the sealed movement where no human eye would ever look again once the watch was closed, was, to his eye, very slightly less than perfect. The spacing of the lines drifted, by an amount that could be measured in microns, across the surface of the bridge. No one would ever know. That was the truth of it. No one in the world but Felix would ever know. Felix would know. Chapter 3. He had learned the trade from his grandfather, who had learned it from his, and it was his grandfather's voice that Felix heard most often in the workshop, even now, 6 years after the old man had died. His grandfather had been a great watchmaker, perhaps a greater one than Felix, though Felix could never quite believe this, and he had taught Felix everything he knew across the long winters of Felix's childhood. The two of them bent over the bench together, while the snow fell outside and the village slept, the old man's patient hands guiding the boys, teaching him to feel what could not be seen, to hear the health of a movement in its ticking, to develop the eye that would, in time, become both his livelihood and his torment. But his grandfather had taught him something else, too, something Felix had heard 1,000 times as a boy and had never once been able to actually do. And it was this. The old man used to say, at a certain point in every watch, putting down his tools, it is good enough. He would say it with satisfaction, with finality, with a kind of peace that Felix had watched with incomprehension as a child and watched now in memory with something closer to grief. It is good enough. His grandfather would close a movement that Felix, even as a boy, could see was not perfect, could see had small flaws his grandfather had simply decided to allow, and the old man would close it and clean his hands and look genuinely happy. And Felix had never understood how he did it, how he simply stopped, how he reached a point where the searching attention switched off and he let the thing be finished. Felix had no such point. This was the central fact of his work in life, and increasingly he was beginning to understand of his life entire. There was no good enough in him. There was only better, and beyond better, better still, an infinite regress of refinement that no watch had ever exhausted, that no piece of work had ever satisfied, that left him at the end of every project not with his grandfather's satisfaction, but with a kind of exhausted surrender, the project taken from his hands by a deadline or a delivery rather than finished by his own decision that it was complete. He had asked his grandfather once near the end how he knew when a watch was good enough. And his grandfather, who was very ill by then and very tired, had looked at him for a long moment with an expression Felix had never forgotten, an expression of love and worry mixed together, and had said, "Felix, the watch is never good enough. You are good enough. You decide it is finished because you are finished, because you have given it what you have to give, and what you have to give is already more than enough. The watch does not need to be perfect. It needs to be let go." Felix had not understood. He had been 19, and he had thought his grandfather in his illness was simply giving up, lowering his standards, and Felix had privately resolved never to lower his. Now he was 26, sitting alone in the workshop at midnight with the finest watch he had ever made and a flaw no one would ever see, and he was beginning, just beginning, to understand what the old man had meant. Chapter 4. He did not fix the flaw. This was, in its small way, the most extraordinary thing Felix had done in years, and he sat with the strangeness of it for a long time. The tools were right there. He could have opened the movement, reworked the decoration on the bridge, corrected the drift in the spacing of the lines, and made the watch, by his own standard, a fraction closer to perfect. And the old Felix, the Felix of last year and every year before it, would have done so without hesitation, would have stayed until 3 or 4 in the morning if necessary, would have redone it twice if the first correction was not itself perfect. But tonight he sat with the loop in his hand and looked at the tiny imperfection that no one would ever see. And he asked himself, for what felt like the first time in his life, a question he had never allowed himself to ask. Who is this for? Not the watch. He knew who the watch was for. The question was about the correction, about the hours he was about to spend, about the standard itself. Who was the perfection for? The collector would never see the inside of the movement. The collector, in fact, would almost certainly never even wear the watch, would place it in a climate-controlled safe alongside his other treasures and look at it occasionally with satisfaction, and the decoration on the internal bridge would sit in its sealed darkness for as long as the watch existed, seen by no one, admired by no one, its microscopic imperfection known to no living person. Except Felix. Always except Felix. And this was the thing he was finally, at midnight, beginning to see clearly. That the standard he served was not the collector's standard, was not the world's standard, was not even really a standard at all in the sense of something external he was measuring against. It was something inside him. It was a voice, and the voice was never satisfied, and the voice had been with him so long that he had mistaken it for himself, had mistaken it for his values, his integrity, his craft, when in fact it was something else, something harder and lonelier and more cruel, a voice that did not actually care about watches at all, but only about the one thing it whispered to him every hour of every day in 10,000 small ways. Not yet. Not good enough. Not yet. He had thought all his life that the voice was what made him excellent. And it was true that the voice had made him excellent, that without it he would not have been able to do what he did, that the same relentless attention that tormented him was inseparable from the gift that let him build machines of impossible precision. But he was beginning to understand that the voice took more than it gave, that a person could be excellent and still be allowed to rest, that the flaw in the bridge was not actually the problem. The problem was a voice that would find a flaw in anything, that had found flaws in everything Felix had ever made, that would find flaws in everything he ever would make, until the day he died, unless he learned to do the one thing his grandfather had tried to teach him, which was not to lower his standard, but to set down the voice. He put the loop on the bench. He looked at the watch with his naked eye, the way the collector would see it, the way the world would see it, and it was, he allowed himself to think, beautiful. It was, in fact, magnificent. It was the finest thing he had ever made. It was good enough. The words felt strange in his mind, foreign, almost frightening, like a language he had studied for years without ever speaking aloud. It was good enough. He made himself sit with them. He made himself not reach for the loop. Chapter 5. He stood up from the bench, which his body protested, because he had been sitting in the same position for hours, hunched in the particular curve of the watchmaker, and he went to the window and opened it and let the cold mountain air come into the warm workshop. The village below was dark. Beyond it, the valley fell away, and beyond the valley the mountains rose, the great peaks of the Jura, and behind them, faintly, the higher Alps, all of it silver under a nearly full moon. The snow on the high slopes glowing with the particular light that snow has at night, which is not really light of its own, but borrowed moonlight given back. He breathed the cold air and looked at the mountains, and he thought about time, which was, after all, his subject, the thing he had devoted his life to measuring with a precision that the natural world simply did not share. The mountains did not keep time. They had been there for 10 million years and would be there for 10 million more, and they did not measure the passing of it, did not divide it into hours and minutes and the fractions of seconds that Felix's instruments could resolve. They simply endured, slowly, at the pace of stone, indifferent to the frantic human project of cutting time into ever finer pieces, a project that Felix now realized he had taken to its furthest extreme, building machines that could measure intervals of time too small for any human purpose, slicing the river of duration into pieces so fine they had no meaning to any life actually being lived. He had spent his whole life measuring time, and almost none of it living in time. This was the thought that came to him at the window, and it arrived with the force of something long known and never before admitted. He measured time perfectly and inhabited it terribly. He could tell you the rate of a movement to within seconds per month, but he could not tell you the last time he had watched a sunset without thinking about something he should be doing, the last time he had eaten a meal slowly, the last time he had let an evening simply be an evening rather than a resource to be optimized, a block of hours to be filled with productive work, or else felt guilty about wasting. His instrument sliced time into perfect intervals, and he himself lived in no interval at all, lived in a permanent, anxious leaning forward into the next task, the next correction, the next not yet good enough thing that needed his attention. The mountains did not lean forward. The moon did not hurry. The snow took all night to do its quiet work of softening the hard edges of the world, and no one stood over it, demanding it work faster. And in the morning, the valley would be beautiful, and the beauty would have come from nothing but patience and time, and the willingness of the snow to fall at its own pace and stop when it was done. The watchmaker, who could not stop, stood at the window and looked at the patient mountains, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he did not feel that he should be doing something else. Chapter 6. He closed the window and came back to the bench, but he did not pick up the loop. Instead, he sat and he listened, because the workshop at night was never truly silent. It ticked. Dozens of watches and clocks in various states of repair and completion sat on the shelves and in the cases around the room, and each of them kept its own time, and together they made a sound that Felix had stopped hearing years ago, the way you stop hearing your own heartbeat. A soft, irregular chorus of ticking, hundreds of tiny mechanisms each marking the passage of the same time in its own slightly different voice. He listened to it now as if for the first time. It was, he realized, a strange and beautiful sound, this room full of measured time, and underneath the strangeness there was something almost unbearably poignant about it, because every one of those ticks was a moment passing, gone, never to return, and the watches marked each one with the same indifferent precision whether the moment had been used well or wasted, whether it had been lived or merely endured. The watches did not care. That was their nature. They measured the time and made no judgment about it. And the judgment, Felix understood all the judgment, every bit of the relentless evaluation of whether each hour had been good enough, came not from the watches, but from him, from the voice, from the part of him that could not let a single moment pass without grading it. What would it be like, he wondered, to let the moments pass the way the watches let them pass, without judgment, without the constant accounting? To let an hour be an hour, neither productive nor wasted, neither good enough nor not good enough, simply an hour, lived, gone, part of the river. The watches did this, the mountains did this, the snow did this, everything in the universe did this except Felix, and he supposed the other people like him, the ones who had been given the terrible gift of attention without the corresponding gift of rest, the ones who could see every flaw, including the flaws in themselves, and could not stop seeing them, could not stop grading, could not stop leaning forward into the next thing that needed to be made better. He picked up one of the watches from the bench, an old pocket watch that had belonged to his grandfather, the one thing in the workshop that was not for sale and not for repair, that simply sat on the bench where his grandfather had left it, still keeping perfect time 6 years after the old man's death. Felix held it in his palm and felt it ticking, the small, steady pulse of it, and he thought about his grandfather closing a movement and saying it is good enough and looking genuinely happy, and he understood now that his grandfather had not been lowering his standards. His grandfather had been doing something far harder than maintaining a standard. He had been choosing again and again every single day to let the moment be enough, to let the work be enough, to let himself be enough. It was not a lowering. It was a kind of courage Felix had mistaken for surrender, the courage to stop, to set down the loop, to look at something imperfect and beautiful and human and say, yes, this, good enough, and mean it. Chapter 7. He cleaned his tools. This was the last ritual of every working night, and he did it now with a care that was not anxious for once, but almost tender, wiping each instrument and returning it to its place on the wall, not because the order needed to be perfect, but because he liked the order, because there was a real pleasure in it that had nothing to do with the voice, a calm satisfaction in a well-kept space that was his and not the voice's, that he was reclaiming now as he understood the difference between caring about something and being tyrannized by it. The watch lay finished on the bench. He did not look at it through the loop again. He placed it gently in its case, the case lined with soft cloth, and he closed the lid. And the small click of the closing latch was, he realized, the sound of letting go, the sound his grandfather must have heard 10,000 times, the sound of a thing released from the workshop and from the maker's endless capacity to improve it, sent out into the world to simply be what it was, which was beautiful, which was enough. He turned off the work lamp. The bright, focused circle of light that had held his attention for hours vanished, and the workshop fell into the soft silver of the moonlight from the window, and the room that had been a place of relentless scrutiny became, in the dimness, simply a room, quiet and warm and full of the gentle ticking of many watches keeping their patient time. Felix stood in it and felt his body, which he rarely felt the ache in his shoulders and his neck and his eyes, the accumulated tension of not just this night, but of years of nights, of a life lived leaning forward, and he felt, underneath the ache, a tiredness so deep and so old that he had stopped recognizing it, the tiredness of a person who had never once, in 26 years, felt that he had done enough to deserve rest. He was going to rest now, not because he had earned it. That was the old logic, the voice's logic. Rest as a reward for sufficient productivity. Rest as something that had to be deserved. He was going to rest because he was tired, because his body needed it, because rest was not a reward for a life well optimized, but simply a part of being alive, as necessary and as unearned as breathing, given freely to the mountains and the snow and the watches that stopped to be wound into every living thing that had ever closed its eyes at the end of a day, whether or not the day had been good enough. He climbed the narrow stairs to the small room above the workshop where he slept, and he lay down, and through the window he could see the moon over the mountains and hear, faintly through the floor, the ticking of the watches below, the soft chorus of measured time continuing without him, keeping itself perfectly well, not needing him to watch it, not needing him to grade it, simply marking the passage of the patient hours while the watchmaker, for once, stopped measuring and let himself be measured, let himself be one more thing held in the gentle accounting of the night. And Felix, the man who could not stop, stopped. He let the watch be finished. He let the work be enough. He let himself be enough. And in the quiet that followed, the quiet that was not empty, but full of moonlight and mountain air and the soft ticking of 100 patient clocks, he felt the voice grow quiet too, not gone. It would never be entirely gone, but quiet, set down for the night like a tool returned to its place. And in its silence he heard, at last, the thing it had always drowned out, which was the simple sound of his own breathing, going in and out in its own perfect time, needing no improvement, requiring no correction, already exactly as it was, good enough. He slept the way his grandfather had closed a watch, with satisfaction, with finality, with peace. The work set down, the day released, the imperfect, beautiful human thing allowed, at last, to simply be. Somewhere in the mountains of Switzerland, in a workshop full of patient ticking, the watchmaker is finally asleep. The watch is finished. The tools are clean and in their places. The voice that was never satisfied has been set down gently for the night. And Felix sleeps. Not because the work was perfect, not because he earned it, just because he is tired, and rest is given freely, even to him. The clocks keep their time without him. The mountains keep their patience. The snow falls at its own pace and stops when it is done. The man who measured time so perfectly is finally living inside it. Good enough. At last, good enough. Good night, Virgo.